Hello everyone, I am Diogo Santos, Professor of Law at the Federal University of Maranhão in Brazil and the Selma University also in Brazil. And this is the presentation of the paper, The Use of Executive Decrees as a Legislative Strategy in the State Level During the COVID-19 Health Crisis in Brazil's state of Maranhão in 2020 and 2021. This presentation is part of the Comparative Politics 1 panel, Contemporary Studies on Brazilian Law and Politics of the 2020 Conference of the New York State Political Science Association. So without further ado, let's start the discussion of our paper. This research, as a background, is inserted in a broader preoccupation in political science of recording in Latin America a history of authoritarianism and clientelism, political instability, and short democratic transitions. In Brazil, as the largest democracy of Latin America, both in territory and GNP and population, and also with some particularities such as not being part of the strictly Hispanic world, but Brazil also has experienced, since the 1980s, a recent democratic transition coming from a past and a tradition of authoritarianism. Brazilian democracy is still consolidating, and the regime needs constant support from society in order to continue with using democratic method. Society support to the democratic regime comes from state performance, mostly in Brazil, in providing security services, care for societal needs and aspirations, and frequently political polarization and tendency to two-party system is also present in Brazil. Usually, all that means, all this theoretical and historical background means that in Brazil, for the democracy to continue stabilizing and consolidating, the government, the regime, must deliver decent or at least good governance in the eyes of society. Otherwise, in the past, society has shown that when a democratic regime or democratic government is ineffective for too long, society may start supporting and asking for democratic regression or authoritarianism, or in the very least, political elites use an environment of dissatisfaction by society with the regime to seek coups, to seek regress Brazilian regime back into authoritarianism. In that scenario, Brazilian democracy has always been, since its redemocratization in the mid-1980s of last century, seeked to deliver not only governance or to function as a regime according to the democratic method of election, checks and balances, a rule of law, respect to minority rights, but also to deliver a governance that will show society that the regime is capable of answering and addressing societal needs and demands in order to continue obtaining support, especially from the masses and the middle class. That is because usually the elites in Brazil, and also in other parts of Latin America, have a tendency to think that authoritarian rule is easier for them as elites to rule the country according to their own interests, which are, of course, more limited than larger or broader societal interests, which would be better addressed, or at least you would expect more chances to be addressed in a democratic setting. The objective of this research is this: with this background, the objective of this research is to discuss the use of normative strategies by the executive power in the state of Maranhão in the face of the SARS-CoV health crisis. that do not require the prior participation of democratic representative bodies in times of serious social emergency. What does that mean? What is that objective? This research is part of a broader research interest of mine that I have followed and also presented before here in the New York State Political Science Association, of this mechanism in Brazil by Brazilian constitution of allowing executive decrees to be used by the president, or in the case of today's presentation, by the state governor, to implement effective policies to address urgent societal needs or aspirations or requirements. Society wants something for now, there's a societal need for now, and this need must be addressed quickly. However, the democratic method of policy making and sometimes of law making may be slow and cumbersome. And in face of the Brazilian tendency or the Brazilian democracy characteristic of needing constant society support, and this support comes from delivering effective governance, well, the government needs an effective and quick tool to implement policy. Okay, and this mechanism is called in Brazil provisional measures, and it's provided for in the federal constitution and in some state constitutions as we are going to see in a few minutes. We assume, or we hypothesize in this research objective, that the executive power in Brazil, both at a federal level and at some of the state level, in some of the states, because not all states adopt in their constitutions provisional measures, this provisional measure legislative mechanism has been preferred by the chief of the executive to implement policy in order to obtain much needed popular support, people support. And thus, this provisional measure use becomes, in a way, a mechanism or a tool for obtaining legitimacy, for achieving recognition by the population, by the people, that the government is able of delivering effective and satisfactory policy. However, the problem of provisional measures is that this legislative mechanism is de facto law that is implemented, that is adopted, bypassing, or at least in the first moments, bypassing legislative controls, legislative checks and balances. And this may pose another threat to the use of democratic method in Brazil. Okay, as this research the paper starts by a rather lengthy definition of democracy, and being democracy a rather troublesome term to define in political science. But for this moment, we focus on, at least for this presentation, we must focus on two aspects of democracy: the method and the satisfaction of society. The method is the regime uses checks and balances, elections, representativeness, representation, state of law, rule of law, and all sorts of this set. There is a perceived set of democratic methodology, of democratic procedures and principles that must be observed and practiced in order for a democratic regime to be recognized as a democracy. On the other hand, or as a second aspect of democracy, it's also necessary that the regime not only uses the method of democracy, which would make for a formal democracy, but not a material democracy. Democracy as a matter of fact. And as a matter of fact, democracy must address society's needs, not focusing on elite needs, but focusing on broader interests, both of majorities and minorities, and also minorities. In this sense, provisional measures, I have found in previous research that provisional measures have been extensively used in Brazil since 1988, which is the year of the current constitution was enacted, as a legislative and regulatory mechanism to deal with social urgency emergency situations, both at the national and state level. And our hypothesis right now is that provisional measures have also been used extensively in the state of Maranhão, which is the state where I reside, and I have closer manner of observing it closer, to also address the SARS-CoV health crisis. We are going to skip here this input and output legitimacy part, but I'm going to keep this here at least for you guys for you to have to be able to visualize it and perhaps read it and pausing the recording. But since we have already discussed, but now we are going to discuss, because we are very short on time, but here we have the possibility of different states, since provisional measures have been adopted by the Brazilian Constitution, the federal constitution in the federal level, but states are free to adopt or to enact, to use provisional measures or not, and that it must be provided or not by the state constitution. And out of the 27-ish state, I say ish because of the federal district, but out of the 27 state constitutions in Brazil, only 6 provide for the use of provisional measures, following or at least mirroring the provisions of the model in the federal constitution, and Maranhão is one of them. So although provisional measures have been extensively using, and I have that, and we have observed that in previous research in a federal level, extensively used for obtaining efficiency legitimacy for the Brazilian democracy in the past. In the state level, the states have shown reluctance in adopting provisional measures in their state constitutions in the state level. Only 6 out of 27 states actually adopt or use provide for provisional measures in their constitutions, and Maranhão is one of them. In general, as another piece of background, the SARS-CoV health crisis was tackled in Brazil at the state level using mostly decrees and not provisional measures. Decrees is a different type. Decrees in the Brazilian legislative technique. Decrees are different, a different legislative instrument in which the parliament or the state assembly, the state congress, gives the governor a kind of a sort of a authorization for enact some specific piece of regulation. How does it work? In a decree, governor only issues a decree once he or she receives prior authorization from the state legislative to do so. So the state legislative issues a authorization to the governor, stating that the governor is authorized to enact specific regulation to provide for rules on children going to school, little children going to school during the health crisis, the COVID health crisis. After that, with that authorization, the governor is then authorized to issue or enact legislation in detail, but under previous authorization, with provisional measures by the legislative. With provisional measures, the governor or the president, for the matter, in the federal level, issues the decree before congressional authorization. That sort of decree or the provisional measure is in force from the moment of its issue, and is only later revised by the legislature. Only later, with a deadline and everything, but only later revised by the legislature. Provisional measures have been preferred, a preferred uh, method of enacting urgent legislation in the federal level. But in the state of Maranhão, is a northern state, one of the poorest and less developed states of Brazil. How have provisional measures have been used? Well, we observed by collecting data from the issuance of provisional measures in Maranhão since 2012 which is when we have available data for until 2021. We have observed an intensive use of provisional measures in areas that are particularly sensitive to democratic legitimacy, like taxation, budget, and finance. This chart here shows the use of such legislation. And during the health crisis, the SARS-CoV health crisis, we have observed an intensification of such tendencies, which is worrisome for Maranhão. As a conclusion, we observe that, in fact, the provisional measures have shown versatility and agility to face crisis. We've observed that very clearly. However, we have, and thus, not however, but as a consequence, we've noticed an extensive use of provisional measures at the state of Maranhão in 2020 in 2020 and 2021, mostly to face the SARS-CoV crisis. The problem here is, with this intensive use, we may wonder about the trust of the population in the democratic level once their crisis arrives. The population may start perceiving, at one hand, that the government is very agile, very effective in implementing fast policy to address a unforeseen crisis, which is very serious. However, that response did not come through proper traditional democratic methods, and that is the observations we have so far. So we open now for questions and discussions, and we wait for the moment when this video gets released into the conference website, and we hope for your discussions and for your questions. Thank you very much, and have a great one.
Hello everyone, my name is Guilherme Santana. I have a degree in history, a degree in law, a postgraduate degree in international relations, professor of history in Maranhão, professor of international law, and president of the Information Technology Commission of OAB Maranhão. I'm here today to present the paper, Interactive Platform for Decisions on Refuse, Analyzing of Data on Venezuelans in Brazil, produced with my dad, Dr. José Cláudio Pavão Santana, and my friend, Cláudio Joel Lostro. The main objective of this work is to identify a standard profile of a Venezuelan refuse rule request, refuse status from the Brazilian government using the Interactive Platform for Decisions on Refuse. To do so, we need to highlight not only the emergence of the platform, but a historical context of affirmation of international human rights in the face of a new contemporary world. This terminology has been used by this researcher for a long time, the new contemporary world, characterizing not only the coexistence of civilizations in their different scales of development, but also indicating the coexistence of human rights dimensions that allow their affirmation in the post-World War II or second post-World War international scenario. In this case, Human dignity assumes an actual value of super principle with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and reproduces within the domestic scenarios of state and assimilation of international human rights, guaranteeing the declaration a kind of exclusive binding power of international treaties. In this context, the migratory flows of refugees increase all over the world, and in Latin America, the serious and generalized violations of human rights in the state of Venezuela, recognized by Mercosur and Brazil, impacts on a large movement of Venezuelans' search of better living conditions. Brazil suffers a huge social impact with the arrival between 2016 and 2019 of more than 70,000 Venezuelans in the borders, requesting the recognition of refuge. The platform is a cooperation between the National Committee for Refugees, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the Ministry of Justice and Public Security of Brazil to concentrate on the internet data from the counter-plenary proceedings to request the status of refuge. From the analysis of these data with the contraposition of the publication refuge numbers of the Observatory of International Migrations and Antibodies was made to identify a standard profile of Venezuelans arriving in Brazil. However, the first serious problem was precisely the divergence between the numbers presented by the Observatory of International Migration and extracted from the platform, which indicate a difference of at least 20,000 Venezuelan refugees not apparent on the platform. Likewise, the number of Venezuelan refugees extracted from the platform is much smaller than that displayed in public spaces in the Brazilian state, which indicates serious underreporting. Even so, the platform was used to identify a standard Venezuelan profile using filters, age, gender, and reasons for inclusion. From where we observe that 55% of Venezuelans arrived in Brazil are between 30 and 59 years old, are men, and 3 human rights violations in their own country of origin. So now we present to you the 4 dashboards that make up the platform. The cover or home dashboard, onde we can see Projeto de Cooperação para Análise das Decisões de Refúgio, presents the platform to you. Dashboard 2, the decisions present in graphics, where you can see the graphics and explanation about the data. Dashboard 3, the decisions present with the possibility of filtering data. And dashboard 4, decision resources. The resource of the decisions of plenary of CANAR about the concessions of refuge for Brazilian government. Also, we know that the study of Venezuelan refugees goes far beyond what is offered in the work. However, our objective was to deliver a standard profile that can contribute to the social policies and of reception of these individuals. We appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk with you about the refugees Venezuelans in Brazil. Thank you and goodbye.
Hello, everybody. My name is Juan Didier Brusac. I have a doctorate degree in law by the Federal University of Paraíba, and I'm a professor and researcher at the Federal University of Maranhão. I'm here to present this scientific article named Legal, Social, and Political Aspects of the Nation of Quilombola Territories, an analysis of the Jair Bolsonaro government from 2019 to 2021. First of all, we have to explain some concepts. What are the Quilombola? Quilombola are traditional people. They are protected by the Convention 169 of the International Labor Organization, and they are traditional people from Brazil that have some ethnical aspects on their living and their organization, and they are marked by this black ancestrality from Africa. We have in our federal constitution of 1988 the right to the territory for Quilombola people. Federal Constitution of 1988 also have those rights for the Quilombola people. And one of that is the Article 68 of the Transitional Constitutional Provisions Act. And the text of this article occupying their lands, definitive ownership is recognized, and the state must issue them the respective titles. So there's a legal provision in the federal constitution in Brazil that Quilombola have the right to land, right to the occupied lands, and how can we give to Quilombola those lands, this formal recognition of those lands. We have the decree number 4887, 2003, that have the process, the administrative process of the land titling for quilombolas, and there's have many rules, and one of those rules is that the National Institute of Colonization and Agrarian Reform, that is named in Brazil as INCRA, is the institute that have to do this, the titling recognition. So we have here a legal structure, an administrative um, provision of who is the the institute that have to do the process of taking quilombolas. We have the right to the land to quilombolas. We have the right to environmental of quilombolas, but we have a Brazilian context that doesn't uh, contribute to high numbers of titles to quilombola people. So we have the provision in law, in the constitution, in federal laws, but we don't have many titles for those quilombola communities. So in Jair Bolsonaro government, this is worse, is a worse scenario because we have federal government that doesn't care about quilombola rights, doesn't care about the number of titles that have the quilombola communities, and this marks a context of many others' rights violated in this period from 29 to from 219 to 221. So this is the Brazilian context about the quilombo, the the titling of quilombolas lands, and we have here as some elements of the research. First of all, the theme. The theme, the theme of this paper is quilombola land titling. And the delimited theme is the analysis of quilombola titling at the INCRA, is the institute, National Institute of Colonization and Reform during the Jair Bolsonaro government from 219 to 221. And the problem is in what extent the quilombola demarcation and titling was guaranteed in that period, in the Jair Bolsonaro government, with the hypothesis of insufficient land titling resulting from the political ideology and the current federal government. So we have here a problem that despite we have the provision in law, in the constitution, the land, the right to land, right to the territory, the right to environmental. We don't have in the other way a protection by the federal government, by the Jair Bolsonaro government. So this is a problem, and we have to show here in this paper. We want to show here in this paper what is the the real scenario about the quilombola teaching. So we have here some objectives. First, we have described the legal foundation of quilombola titling, present the number of quilombola titles in the Bolsonaro government, and critically analyze the role of the federal government in quilombola titling. So, first of all, we have to talk about a little bit about the legal provisions, foundations about the quilombola titling. So we want to talk about the decree. We will talk about a little bit about the constitutional provision about the land titling, quilombola, for quilombolas. And in the second place, we need to show the numbers of quilombola titles in the Bolsonaro government and criticize those numbers because they are not the best scenario we have to protect quilombola people. So, and then we have the results of this research, and first we have to talk about the increased low investment. That means that there is not money enough to do the taking of quilombola lands. We don't have, in general scenario of INCRA, money to do agrarian reform, and also we don't have money to do the titling of quilombola lands. So that is the first problem we have here in Jair Bolsonaro government. It means that we don't have the money to do the quilombola titling, we don't have the guarantee of the territory, and we have more situations of conflict, of violence, because formally we don't have the protection of the land. So this is the first problem in Jair Bolsonaro context government. Second, considering the first 766 days of government, only 105 certification with 50 per year. So in the first 2 years, we have a low number of certification. That means that the number of quilombola communities that want to be recognized as quilombola is low. So we have low number of certification, and then we don't have the recognition of quilombola communities, and they don't have the right to land. So in the first place, we have a low investment. In the second place, we have a low recognition of quilombola communities. Well, in the third place, we have some numbers. We have the numbers of the Pro-Índio Commission of São Paulo. We have numbers of the Brazilian Association of Journalism, of Investigative Journalism, and Brazil, the Brazilian Transparency. And we have here numbers of a researcher named Benedetti. So the number of titling we have here in the Pro-Índio Commissions of São Paulo, we have 4 titles during the Jair Bolsonaro government. The first one, Nossa Senhora de Fátima do Crauateua. This is one of quilombola titling, Riacho Fundo, Rio dos Macacos, and Tati, Tuquara, São Sebastião, Arajá e Boa Esperança. So in this first data, we have only 4 titles in 3 years. In Abrage and Transparência Brazil Transparency, we have only 3 titles. And Benedetti showed that we have 5 titles. So there's a worse scenario. We have a bad scenario about the quilombola titling. If we have 5, 3, or 4, there's not a good number, because in 3 years we don't have the protection of those lands, and the protection leads to a problem that increase the violence in the agrarian field, and the communities aren't in safe. They don't have a safe house, a safe environment, a safe territory. That's a huge problem to take care. So in resume, we have here numbers that show that Jair Bolsonaro government doesn't care about the quilombola titling. We have to highlight that in the presidential run in 2018. Bolsonaro said that doesn't care about quilombolas, indigenous people, uh, women rights, and other other minorities in society, in Brazilian society, and it say and Bolsonaro said that will not do the agrarian reform. That Bolsonaro said that will not do the titling of lands for quilombolas and indigenous people. And now we can see in 1920 and 21 that he have haven't done the titling correctly. INCRA doesn't have investment, have low numbers of quilombola certifications and low number of quilombola titles. So I want to thank you to see this presentation and see ya.
Hi, I greet all of you who participate with us in the annual conference of the New York State Political Science Association. I'm Tiago Alisson Cardoso de Jesus, Brazilian professor and researcher. My speech is about a serious criminal issue today: lynchings, vulnerability, and punitive society in the context of Brazilian necropolitics. Experienced the time of the spectacularization of violence, which occurs new counters in recent decades, millennia-long market in human history, and nowadays associated with the sacrificial conception that a good bandit is a dead bandit, and that demonstrates the marks of a punitive society as it is the contemporary one. It is also in the field of private revenge struggle that the state's monopoly of the right to punish is put in suspense and questioned through the phenomenon of lynchings, when individuals provoked to resolve circumstantial dilemmas go through variables and contexts several to practice what is prohibited by law and repudiated by the so-called rationalization of life in society through a logic that challenges the most expensive postulates for the consolidation of a rule of law with a constitutional matrix and committed to the scenario of deep interaction that is an international humanitarian plan. In this way, the question is, what are the foundations, contexts, and profiles of the phenomenon of private revenge experienced in Brazil, specifically in Maranhão, and to what extent they demonstrate the crisis of legitimacy of the Brazilian state and of the various institutions that make up the criminal justice system. In this context, enchantment in terms of human rights and the trivialization of evil linked to the most harmful repercussions of structural violence, inequalities, and the mitigation of rights. Such inquiries are also the general objective of this research that is now being published. Furthermore, the central hypothesis is that the protagonism of the popular in the practice of the various constitutive acts of leaching phenomenon and its spectacularization is based on the indifference to the pain of the other, seen as an enemy to be annihilated, in the discredit and distrust in the republican and democratic institutions that would legitimize the state monopoly of the right to punish, limited by the guarantist postulates, and consequently by structural violence, which is invisible and silenced. In this multiple phase, in the context of culture of fear, punitivism, and the current juridical political instability of the human person protection system. Certainly, in accordance with what was presented, the following secondary hypotheses were established. The cases of leaching are closely related to the repercussions of historical structural violence in Brazilian society, specifically in Maranhão. Lynchings denote fragility in the contemporary civilizing process, disbelief in republican and democratic institutions, and the discontrol in the punitive environment based on practice, discourses, and mentalities aimed at the annihilation of others seen as public enemy. Starting from Foucault, for the analysis with archaeological scientific posture, the democratic state of law in the post-1980 was chosen as a unit of analysis in micro-context and the locus of Maranhão, Brazil, as a unit for investigation, contextually situated. Therefore, the problematization will take place from specialized literature through the election of the categories private revenge, lynchings, violence, structural violence, objectification, fear, and criminal justice system to investigate the proposed objective and publicize the results, providing an effective bias to the social function of the university in which such research finds shelter and affirmed as an instrument of critical thinking, the result of scientific rigor and refined theoretical methodological proposal. About lynchings as a manifestation of private revenge, several fundamentals can be inferred, vectors and analyses systemized from a careful observation of the phenomenon at the locus. The cultural and social foundations bring to light the punitive discourse, which reflects individualism and meritocracy, in addition to collective hypocrisy, which even today lives the Manichaeism of the good and good citizen of the considered criminal and insists on not knowing that. By an accurate criminological analysis, at some point everyone was in conflict with the criminal law. In addition, socioculturally, it is still inferred. Social authoritarianism and the culture of punishment that has physical and immediate punishment as a legitimate strategy of repression with moral content, such as prison as the main form of containment and neutralization, such as the mass incarceration experienced in the world as the main political criminal strategy of the nation states, as well as the intimidation and spectacularization of the repressive act in the midst of network society, which socialize, viralizing the tragic and to be given to those who deserve or do justice for having violated a community standard and politically valued as relevant. Indeed, in a world of innumerable connections and virtualized relationships, mass communication of formidable technical power is engaged in a propagation vast and unprecedented vengeance aims to feed and reinforce the worst prejudice to public encourage the identification of the enemy as the time at the time, which ends up generating the violence solution that devastates the human rights and sooner or later it ends in genocide. Allied to this, the discourse of the good bandage is a dead bandage, empirically verified in an opinion pool, is the analyzed scientifically from the sociological framework that guides this discursive finding and that concludes that the Brazilian can kill, torture, lynch. When he does not do directly, he often justifies and approves. Criminal violence expressed by the lynchings and the delimitation in this research aligns with structural violence, in addition to the paper carried out by the sociologist looking at Brazil, the profile of lynching cases in Maranhão, scrutinizing places of occurrence and victims of sacrificial revenge, demonstrate that what truly precedes the fateful is the misfortune of structural violence, such as the remaining margin from the center of wealth, material poverty, and from repression for not accessing available opportunities, for not being available in material poverty. 18, as well as from the deterioration of essential public services due to the fragile performance and the providing face of the state in that field of struggle. Conclusions. Out of the agenda, however, it is highlighted the cases of lynching practice against women, LGBTQIA+ communities, and traditional communities, reflecting the invisibility and the phenomenon against other subjects of rights that historically were denied in this concrete essentially the inexistence of accurate data on occurrences in the countryside with regard to the period prior to 2015. Such questions suggest that the phenomenon did not occur, and above all, the difficult sacrificial violence, penal classification, and even intense underreporting and society approval, and the inefficiency of the criminal justice system. For these unspoken questions, suffice it to assume that it would be unreasonable to understand that this modality of private revenge would be an exclusively urban phenomenon against males, and that vulnerable groups are historically violated, in the words of unofficial data, would be immune. Subjects are unhighlighted, rights and violated, life is trivialized, the person is refused. The machine for greeting people reinvents itself with new technologies to make new forms to torture spectacular, out of step with the legal acts proclaimed at the nation and international humanitarian level. Contemporary sacrificial violence is a complex and still invisible social issue, a tense phenomenon to be unveiled and dealt with through serious police policies aimed at enforcing rights in contemporary societies with so many risks and uncertainties. Therefore, the position of science that committed to facing social vulnerabilities has repercussions for the visibility and untouchable issues, as well as fecunds new mentalities and postures necessary for the realization of the culture of peace as a norm of integrity aimed at the construction of democratic, inclusive spaces committed to respecting the human person, even in conflict with criminal law. Thank you.